you need to stop moving for just a moment and listen to this with an unshakable, profound calm. Because what you are about to receive does not come from random chance. This is not a simple coincidence or an illusion created by your own lingering hope. It is a real, entirely invisible, yet undeniable movement happening in the dark. A heavy, psychological movement that is heading directly towards you. For the past few days, or perhaps weeks, you may have been physically feeling things that are incredibly difficult to logically explain. A silent, buzzing restlessness in your chest. A strange, heavy inner certainty, exactly as if something massive were rapidly approaching, and your soul simply knew it long before your rational mind could process it. This sensation you are carrying is not fear. It is your deep somatic intuition violently awakening. And according to the foundational laws of psychology, specifically the deep work of Carl Jung, when the human unconscious is suddenly set into motion, it never does so for no reason. It does so because a long-hidden, buried truth is finally, desperately seeking a way out into the light. Somewhere right now, a specific person, someone who has made a massive, permanent impact on the architecture of your life, is being forcefully pushed towards the truth by a psychological force infinitely greater than their fragile ego, a force they can no longer successfully ignore. This person desperately tried to convince themselves that they could easily go on without you. They systematically attempted to transform their silence into distance, and that distance into permanent oblivion. But the human unconscious does not work like that. What we aggressively repress does not peacefully die in the dark. It merely waits. It gathers strength. It mutates. And it always, inevitably, comes back at the exact moment when the soul no longer possesses the sheer, exhausting energy required to maintain the lie. You physically sensed this shift because the psychological bond between you was never actually severed. Even if you tried your absolute hardest to move on, even if you expertly pretended to the outside world that you had completely healed, something deep down remained entirely open, not out of lingering pain, but out of unresolved truth. When a massive psychological event is drawing near, the person on the other side goes through a highly specific, agonizing phase. It is a phase where absolutely everything they carefully built to replace you violently begins to lose its color. Their cheap daily distractions are no longer enough to numb the mind. The other, newer connections they formed seem incredibly bland, superficial, and entirely devoid of spark. And this rapidly growing internal void acts exactly like a pressure cooker, a suffocating pressure that forces them to finally look directly at what they ran away from. They are beginning to brutally understand that denying you was a massive, exhausting burden. So, something heavy is currently brewing in the silence, a confession. It may not be perfect, it will likely not be cinematic or romantic, but it will be undeniably brutally sincere. And that is exactly where you will be deeply surprised, because this impending confession will not just be about you or how much they miss your presence. It will answer the ultimate question. Why did they really withdraw? And why didn't that cold silence mean what you feared it meant? When someone disappears without a logical explanation, it is basic human nature to assume that if they left, they simply did not care enough to stay. But according to depth psychology, what drives someone to run away is incredibly rarely the absence of deep feelings. Much more often than not, it is a terrifying, overwhelming excess of them. This person absolutely did not distance themselves because you didn't matter. They distanced themselves precisely because you mattered far too much. You were a blindingly bright mirror standing in their presence. When they looked at you, they did not just see a partner. They saw their own terrifying vulnerability. They saw every single crack in the armor they had spent a lifetime building. Carl Jung called this specific psychological phenomenon the confrontation with the shadow. And for many individuals who lack deep emotional maturity, this confrontation is entirely unbearable. It feels like a psychological death. So, the fragile ego automatically chooses flight. It masterfully transforms deep fear into cold justification. It buries raw emotion under heavy silence. Their departure was never a genuine rejection of your worth. It was a frantic, panicked attempt to regain a sense of total control exactly when their heart had started to take up entirely too much space in their mind. During this extended period of silence, they actively convinced themselves that sweet oblivion would eventually come. But what the arrogant ego constantly forgets is that their soul remembers everything. Your prolonged silence may have been experienced by you as a deep wound, but in their reality, this silence was never empty. It was laden with severely suppressed thoughts. It was filled with restless, agonizing emotions that they desperately tried to stifle. But the immutable law of psychology dictates this. The more you aggressively suppress a truth, the more violently it seeks to breathe. And today, right now, that internal pressure has simply become too great for their mind to contain. If you are recognizing this painful psychological loop right now, make sure to hit the subscribe button. We cover these concepts every day, diving deep into the dark psychology of human connection, and you absolutely will not want to miss the tools coming in the next breakdown. Exactly what was highly tolerable for them yesterday is absolutely no longer tolerable today. Exactly what could easily be denied a month ago is now violently beginning to impose itself on their daily reality. You must understand this incredibly clearly. A person who truly feels nothing absolutely does not struggle internally. A massive inner struggle only exists when something profoundly essential is at stake. The prolonged silence was absolutely never proof of a lack of love. It was the ultimate sign of a crippling inability to accept it. And now that this fragile inability is completely crumbling into dust, another phase begins. A phase where the buried truth frantically seeks the most fitting, realistic form to finally be expressed. How exactly does the unconscious mind prepare for a massive confession? The unconscious mind never expresses itself neatly or directly. It relentlessly pushes the human being to the exact breaking point, where continuing to remain silent suddenly becomes infinitely more painful than simply speaking the terrifying truth. And that is exactly what is happening to this person right now. Long before any physical contact is made, something fundamental has already shifted completely within them. It is a persistent, silent agitation that they can absolutely no longer ignore or drink away. It is a constant, heavy impression that the cold silence as they are stubbornly maintaining, is no longer a shield of protection, but a massive, cowardly betrayal of their own soul. The illusion was entirely safe as long as this person could tell themselves a logical, neat story. But over time, this artificial, plastic coherence completely cracked. Your image returned at completely unexpected moments. Your unique energy violently entered their thoughts, their dreams, and their most ordinary memories. This is absolutely not simple nostalgia. It is the ultimate psychological sign that something essential has never, ever been digested or resolved. Gradually, their safe daily life began to lose its entire substance. Exactly what had seemed comforting and reassuring quickly became agonizingly mechanical. What is not made fully conscious ultimately manifests itself as destiny. The more this person tries to avoid this massive truth, the more their own life violently confronts them with it. Lately, you may have experienced sudden, crashing emotional waves completely without any apparent cause, a strange heaviness in the center of your chest, or on the contrary, a sudden, blinding inner certainty that something massive is brewing just over the horizon. These are not your desperate projections. They are the tangible, psychological echoes of an inner movement seeking a way out of their mind and into your reality. Right now, this specific person is violently struggling between two massive fears. The terrifying fear of finally daring to speak out and face your reaction, and the infinitely much deeper, darker fear of remaining silent for entirely too long and losing you forever. They imagine sending you messages. They imagine making calls. Entire, complex conversations are mentally constructed in the dark, and then instantly, cowardly erased. And the longer this massive internal conflict lasts, the more the unconscious completely takes over the steering wheel from the fragile ego. Confession is absolutely no longer a casual option. It becomes a strict psychological necessity. When a confession is rapidly approaching, the human mind often romantically imagines a clear, cinematic scene, a flawless, clear statement of absolute intent. But psychological reality is almost always entirely different. When the deep unconscious violently takes over, it absolutely does not seek elegance, grace, or perfection. It is strictly looking for the release valve. The buried truth absolutely does not come out because everything is finally perfectly ready and aligned. It comes out strictly because continuing to hold it back becomes physically and mentally impossible. And that is exactly why the confession that is rapidly coming toward you probably will not be what you logically expect. It will violently emerge exactly where their control finally breaks down. Exactly what will happen is infinitely more brutal and infinitely more human. An emotional crack in the foundation. One tiny moment too many. A massive accumulation of unspoken words that finally violently overflows the dam. This break can easily take the form of a chaotic, late-night message, an entirely unexpected, rambling phone call, or even a year of cold silence suddenly broken by a single, simple, but incredibly heavily meaningful phrase. Because when the deep unconscious finally speaks, it is absolutely not trying to smoothly convince anyone. It is merely presenting the raw facts of survival. The confession can therefore be highly awkward. It can be intensely hesitant. It might clumsily begin with a veiled apology, a completely trivial question about your life, or an emotion that is visibly difficult for them to contain. But behind this highly imperfect, messy form lies the absolute essential truth. This person absolutely no longer has the strength to fake it. What will deeply surprise you the most is not the exact dictionary content of these words, but the heavy, vibrating energy that absolutely accompanies them. You will physically feel that this is absolutely not a cheap attempt at manipulation. There will be palpable nervousness. There will be visible fear. And that is precisely exactly what will make this specific confession entirely authentic. Someone who feels absolutely nothing does not tremble when they speak to you. It may come as a heavy regret, a reluctant recognition of their massive mistakes. In that exact moment, you will deeply understand that this person is absolutely not only talking about the relationship between you two. They are fundamentally talking about themselves. They are recognizing exactly what they were terrified to be. And this specific recognition completely changes the entire dynamic. There always comes a precise moment when the artificial, carefully maintained equilibrium completely collapses. When internal psychological pressure wildly exceeds a certain threshold, the human psyche desperately seeks an immediate, raw outlet. It is absolutely no longer a question of strong willpower. It is entirely a question of basic emotional survival. The truth slips out in an exhausted sigh, in a poorly prepared, fragmented sentence, in an emotional reaction that goes entirely too far. At this exact moment, you will instantly feel that something is completely different. The voice hesitates. The words heavily stumble. This is absolutely not a game of seduction. It is an absolute, terrifying emotional exhibition. Psychic truth only emerges exactly when the ego is entirely tired of defending itself. They absolutely no longer speak to protect themselves. They speak entirely to free themselves from the torment. What makes this impending moment entirely inevitable is that the heavy silence has finally become infinitely heavier than the massive risk of rejection. Continuing to stubbornly remain silent would now require an amount of psychological energy she absolutely no longer possesses. So, even though the massive fear of your rejection is still very much there, it is absolutely no longer dominant. The desperate need to speak out completely prevails. You will deeply understand that this confession is the bloody culmination of a massive, long inner struggle that you were entirely blind to. Until today, this person was absolutely not ready, not because they felt nothing for you, but entirely because their massive ego still held entirely too much power over their actions. But true, raw connection violently takes absolutely all of that away. It brutally exposes you. What has completely changed right now is the internal balance of power. Their logical mental justifications have completely crumbled into dust. Continuing to deny exactly what they felt would now require infinitely more energy than simply facing the fire. There is also another massive essential factor at play: the terrifying fear of your actual permanent loss. Before, they assumed you would simply always be waiting in the background. But today, something massive shifted. They finally understood that you could truly, permanently move on, that your life could beautifully progress entirely without them. This brutal realization acted exactly like a physical shock to their system. They finally realized that time is absolutely no longer an abstract concept, that later is absolutely no longer guaranteed, and that each passing day of their stubborn silence brings them infinitely closer to a massive point of no return where you are gone forever. This moment has finally arrived also exactly because you have fundamentally changed. You completely stopped frantically chasing after an answer. And paradoxically, beautifully, it is exactly this absolute detachment that powerfully allowed the reverse movement to begin. By completely ceasing to demand their presence, you beautifully created the massive, empty space exactly where the other person could finally, clearly see exactly what they risk permanently losing. Confession is happening right now exactly because absolutely all the required psychological conditions are finally in place. The massive ego is weakened. The raw emotion is clear. The permanent loss is entirely possible. And exactly when this confession finally comes, it will be incredibly tempting for you to focus solely on the spoken words. But a raw confession is absolutely never simply a message addressed to another person. It is first and foremost a massive internal act, a profound reorganization of the entire psyche. This confession means, first and foremost, that you were absolutely not an illusion. That exactly what you felt was neither exaggerated nor desperately projected. For a very long time, you may have heavily doubted your own deep intuition. You deeply doubted your very own worth. This word that finally arrives acts as a belated but incredibly powerful validation of your accurate perception. But there is something infinitely deeper. This confession means that this person has finally stepped directly through their own dark shadow. When a violently rejected part of the self is finally recognized, this integration completely changes the entire nature of the bond. It is absolutely no longer a toxic relationship based on lack or deep fear. It is now based on an accepted, raw truth. For you, this massive moment also means a brand new responsibility. Your role is not to instantly forgive or blindly accept absolutely anything immediately. Your role is to remain entirely, unshakably centered. Your responsibility is to absolutely not fall right back into the old, toxic patterns of chasing. This confession is absolutely not an automatic invitation to blindly go back to how things were. It is a powerful invitation to look at the relationship with completely new eyes. It permanently puts an end to the agonizing waiting, but it also heavily forces you to finally choose yourself. Every single genuine realization calls for a massive decision, and this absolute decision must stem entirely from the profound inner clarity you have violently gained during the silence. When this massive confession comes, the exact moment will be incredibly charged with heavy emotion, massive tension, and old memories. And precisely for that specific reason, exactly what you do, or more importantly, what you do not do, at this exact moment will be completely decisive. When the truth finally violently emerges, it absolutely does not demand an immediate, panicked reaction. It demands absolute conscious presence. The absolute biggest psychological trap you could possibly fall into would be to quickly respond entirely from the perspective of your old, bleeding wound, because this confession absolutely does not come to reopen a heavy wound. It comes entirely to reveal whether that wound has truly, finally healed. The absolute first key thing you must understand is exactly this. You have absolutely nothing left to prove to this person. You absolutely do not have to desperately convince anyone or justify exactly what you felt. The heavy words that are coming toward you right now exist entirely, precisely because you completely stopped demanding them. So, exactly when this person finally speaks, your role will absolutely not be to anxiously interrupt them or desperately fill the heavy silences to make them comfortable. Your ultimate role will be to simply listen, completely calmly, with a massive inner stability that you absolutely did not have before they left. Your entirely conscious, heavy silence will be infinitely more powerful than absolutely any immediate, panicked response. It is highly possible that the raw emotion will attempt to overwhelm you. That is completely normal. But the massive difference this time is that you are absolutely no longer entirely engulfed by it. True emotional maturity is strictly recognized by the profound ability to heavily feel an emotion entirely, without being completely controlled by it. This profound restraint is absolutely not coldness. It is absolute inner mastery. It politely promises absolutely nothing in the heavy moment, but it also angrily closes absolutely nothing off. A true confession absolutely does not require an instant, rushed decision. It demands massive space. Observe entirely not only exactly what they say, but exactly how they say it. True sincerity is flawlessly recognized by total consistency, deep coherence, and the absolute absence of frantic pressure. Finally, remember this ultimate truth. Your core worth absolutely does not depend on this confession. It completely precedes it. This massive moment is absolutely not a validation of your importance. It is merely a confirmation that you finally beautifully chose yourself. Whatever the final outcome, you remain perfectly aligned. When the heavy truth comes out, it is never for nothing. Life absolutely never takes us violently away from something, without simultaneously beautifully bringing us incredibly closer to ourselves. While this person brutally confronted their own dark shadow, you were forcefully pushed to do some massive, essential inner work. You finally learned to completely stop betraying yourself. You learned to beautifully refocus your powerful energy. And it is precisely this massive transformation within you that perfectly made this entire confession possible in the first place. The truth that is heavily emerging right now is absolutely not here to magically repair the broken past. It beautifully confirms that your deep intuition absolutely never lied to you. But it also heavily places you before a massive new responsibility. The absolute responsibility of no longer ever accepting cheap love from the perspective of fear or deep dependence. Whatever the ultimate outcome of this confession, you are absolutely no longer waiting in the dark. You are standing entirely in the light. And that unshakable light is your absolute true power. If this deep dive into the psychology of unresolved attachment finally gave you the answers you have been searching for, please click the video right over here on the screen. It perfectly breaks down the next critical stage of emotional detachment, showing you exactly how to protect your own peace moving forward. And you will absolutely want to watch it right now. Stay strong, trust your reality, and keep moving forward.